Hello everybody and welcome to our second live show from the Abu Dhabi Yas Marina Silverstone Fan Village. As we speak, the rain is easing off. We've had 2 practice sessions for the British Grand Prix and here we are with our second live show from Whittlebury Hall, very near the Beckett's complex of the Silverstone Grand Prix circuit. A great lineup again of panelists on the table up here. To my far right, Craig Scarborough, of course a friend of the Racer's Edge. Great to have you on board, Craig. Thank you very much for being here again. I know you've been down in the pit lane. We're looking forward to getting your insight on what's been going on technically today. To my immediate right, Rob Wilson, again, needs no introduction to fans of the Racer's Edge. Rob, the world's preeminent driver coach. I'm just going to say that, not one of, the world's. Rob was worked with many of the drivers you're seeing on the track at Silverstone in Formula 1, GP2, GP3, and Porsche Super Cup. So lots to talk about there. On my left, Richard Cregan, CEO of the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix Yas Marina Circuit and former team manager of the Panasonic Toyota Formula 1 team. Great to have you, Richard. And finally, on the far left, Andrew Marriott, an old friend of mine, one of the great British motor racing journalists. He was ARM of Motoring News in the great days of Motoring News and is host of Silverstone TV this weekend, doing lots of interviews up and down the paddock in the pit lane, and a wonderful show too they are putting on for the fans. I should begin by thanking Yas Marina and Abu Dhabi for this magnificent fan village that we have here. Wi-Fi available to all the campers. There's about 12,000 here. We announced yesterday the winner of the golden ticket, which is 2 prizes and 2 tickets to the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix. Wonderful prize. And without their support, we wouldn't be doing this show either. So thank you very much indeed to everybody in that. And Richard, just to kick that off, Abu Dhabi, British Grand Prix, sunshine, rain. Tell us a little bit about that relationship.
Well, I think when we came here last year, we told everybody it didn't rain in Abu Dhabi, and then suddenly it just poured down here. And we feel a bit guilty because we've come back this year and it's rained again. So I don't know if it's something to do with us, but I think it just, we welcome everybody to a sunny Abu Dhabi, and we're very, very grateful to the amount of British motorsport fans who actually travel to Abu Dhabi. It's our biggest market in the UK, and we have a great support from here, and it works so well, and we enjoy having everybody, and we look after them and give them a great time in Abu Dhabi. So they're always very welcome.
Well, Richard, let's get straight into it. In yesterday's show, we were talking about how we must have more testing in Formula 1 and a few other aspects aside. And no doubt the World Motorsport Council was listening to everything we said down at Goodwood where they were meeting, because today they announced a number of regulations for 2014, not the least of which is 4 2-day mid-season tests from here on in, from 2014 onwards. And that is wonderful news, I think, for fans all over the world, starved of test sessions of the type we used to know and love. We still have the 3 pre-season tests, and in addition, a further one, an engine test in January, so 4 pre-season tests, and then these mid-season tests. And Abu Dhabi, a circuit that the teams must be looking at as a potential test venue, the weather, the location.
Definitely.
And you're on the list there.
I mean, they approached us some time ago about the idea, and the teams were very interested to come down. So obviously we're more than happy to welcome the teams, because at that time of the year there's consistent conditions, there's good track temperatures, there's good air temperature, and I think the big thing for next year is obviously testing the turbo engines. So I mean, you've got hot weather conditions which they need to be testing in. So I mean, it'd be a great thing for us. Depends on how they would do it and when it would be before the season, but I mean, we would certainly welcome them with open arms.
Well, you were talking yesterday about potentially doing it before the first race. Of course, that's going to be pretty tight, but in a way that makes logistical sense to go on to Bahrain.
It does, and I think that's what Formula 1 has to be looking at, is on one hand, everybody is talking about the cost of Formula 1. But I think once you start actually trying to implement cost-cutting exercises, there's always a resistance. So, I mean, teams have to get together and actually say, we want to do this. And I think it's a great way of saving quite significant costs. They're going to fly down to Bahrain anyway, so they might as well come via Abu Dhabi, do a test there. It would be great if they could do a second test in Bahrain, rebuild for the race and race. So it would make logistic sense as well as everything else.
Well, lots of other regulation changes as well. Andrew, if I can just bring you in here, one of them for next year, an extra set of tyres to be used on Friday mornings, which will encourage teams to go out on Fridays. And I guess for you today, when there was not much going on this Friday morning. Understandably so, kind of. The teams have had a lot of wet weather running already this year, strangely, thanks to the jet stream or whatever it is. What was it like for you today with on that first session?
Well, it's a very funny situation what we're doing at Silverstone TV, because we handed over to the FOM feed. So I was busy getting interviews, or trying to get interviews. It's never easy when a session's going on like that. And but the boys like Ian Titchmarsh, who was doing the circuit commentary, which is tapped into us, they were having to work really hard. They got nothing to talk about, of course, other than what's going to come in the next 2 days. So it's always difficult, but what can the teams do? Well, they can't run, can they? They don't want to crash the cars, which is possible, and we saw one go off. They've got lots of data. They know, because they've got very good reports on the weather, that it's going to be dry on Sunday, so they don't need to run. And the only way to make it good for the fans is for it to be mandated that unless you run 5 laps, 6 laps, you get a penalty on the grid. That's the only way they can do it. Otherwise, they just won't.
Well, although this extra set of tyres might make a difference.
That's going to help. Yeah.
Whether that will
I haven't seen the full circular yet on what was decided in Goodwood today, but there seem to be quite a few interesting pointers I'm sure you'll elaborate on.
Yeah, well, what I was going to do was just amend what I said, because, of course, in the wet, that won't necessarily make any difference.
In the wet, that won't make any difference, no, but as a point, yes.
But then we have to go back to the Andrew Marriott solution and just penalise them for not going out.
Yeah,
if they don't crash or go out, one of the two. So, that'll be interesting. Craig, some technical news today from the World Council. Rear brakes come under discussion as one of the elements.
Yeah, this is, again, something that may be kind of hard to understand. They've actually allowed you to have an electronic rear brake balance set up for next year. And the reason they're doing this next year, as you may know, they're changing the engines, and they're going to have a lot more engine recovery systems. And when the KERS is actually charging as you're braking, it's braking the rear brakes for you. So the actual rear brakes aren't doing quite so much work. But because there's going to be so much engine management and energy management going on with the car next year, the brakes will be quite inconsistent, because you won't always be charging on braking depending on the state of the batteries. So rather than the driver forever changing the brake balance manually, they're allowing an electronic system to take that over for you. Obviously, there is a concern that will then allow the teams to put some kind of anti-lock braking system in, because you've got a degree of control on the rear brakes that you wouldn't normally have. But because it's all controlled through the McLaren ECU, they can actually prevent you having any form of ABS with this setup.
And we were talking yesterday about wind tunnel testing and CFD and perhaps limiting that. Richard, again, as I say, they've probably been listening to what we were saying. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, yesterday evening we were saying about one way of curbing the expenditure is actually reducing the amount of wind tunnel testing and CFD testing. And that's what they've done. I haven't seen the details of it, but I think it's great news, and it can actually mean teams maybe sharing wind tunnel facilities. So maybe for the more junior teams who don't have their own wind tunnels, maybe they would have access to some of the bigger teams' wind tunnels, who then will be eager to rent them out and try and get something back. But I think it's a good move, and combine that with testing on track. Again, going back to what we discussed yesterday, it's giving young drivers the chance to get out in the cars and show what they can do.
And just to give you an idea of how much wind tunnel time is used at the moment, in a 60% tunnel, limited to 60%, most teams run those tunnels, or in the tunnel, 6 days a week minimum, 24 hours a day, and they have approximately 60 to 70 designers working on new components. And if you average it out, it works out, believe it or not, at 240 components a day, new components being made. It is absolutely staggering. And of course, what will happen is that other parts of the industry will come into play. And we were talking in 2 shows ago about the software company, the IT systems company being used at Lotus F1 Avanade, and there are plenty of those in Formula One, similar. And the efficiency of that is going to become more and more important, the software that they generate to enable you to maximize the data that you're getting from these new limitations. That's going to be a really interesting new development, I think, in Formula One. Let's move on to today's running, the highlight of which, I guess, was Felipe Massa's accident, and it was a pretty sad-looking accident. He got on the power too early. He was running the new, what Ferrari called the prototype Prairies, the tyre, which has basically got a new moulding system to replace, to try to solve the problem of the delamination. And that's something that they were running. It didn't have any colouring on the sidewall. It was a prototype tyre. In Felipe's words, it wasn't yet up to temperature. He lost the back end. He spun to the inside. Easy to do, Rob, I guess, and easy to be an armchair critic. But at the end of the day, the tyres aren't up to temperature. You've got to be pretty careful with the right foot.
Well, yeah, and you should be feeling that coming up to it. The rate you move your body, and Felipe's pretty abrupt at moving that. If you could be a little more progressive about it, you would feel it coming. And you also know you've got to test these things out on the slow, easy corners where just a little blip here and a little move with the wheel. You get those messages, and it just seems to happen to Felipe too often.
Yeah, and we were saying yesterday that his record at Silverstone isn't very good either. I said there was a wet race in which he spun, I think, 6 times, but apparently there were 2 races where he spun 6 times. I'd forgotten the Sauber one. I mean, Andy, you might remember that with Felipe. His record here at Silverstone is not a great one.
Not good. He's never been on the podium here in all the years he's come here. I was in a press conference, a Ferrari press conference yesterday, and I got the feeling from him that he was starting to talk about what he would do once he stopped Formula One, and obviously prompted a little bit by the Weber News. And he talked about GT racing and sports car racing. He said, I don't really want to do that because I don't want to overtake a lot of slower cars, which obviously you've got to do at an event like Le Mans. And he said, I fancy doing the DTM, which I'd never heard him say before. So obviously we've got Timo Glock in the DTM this year, is a series that I cover, and doing an excellent job with BMW. Whereas in the past, more recently, we've had David Coulthard and so on, not really showing, but Glock's doing a good job. Interesting if Massa came, and I think he may.
Just on that, Andy, and I don't want to get too sidetracked on things, but I know you are a DTM aficionado, and you saw Paul de Resta in his very early days there. Daniel Joncadella's name being mentioned in the young driver test now, I think, with Williams as a potential 1 day or maybe 2 days in the Williams. Good guy. Won Macau, won the Euro F3 Championship. How's he been going in DTM?
Did indeed. Struggled until the most recent race at Lausitz Ring, and then Mercedes had a very strong car there. They had a very strong car there, and this was the best performance we've had. Got well into the points. Still outshone by people like Rob Wickens, but the first time we really saw him going well and going quicker than his fellow Spaniard and the previous year's Formula 3 champion, Roberto Merri, who's been in the DTM a year, and Juncadella outshone him. So it'll be interesting to see how he goes.
Rob Wickens, now there's a talented name who's we haven't mentioned recently. No. He's in DTM, but wow, that guy's got a lot of talent. Shame he's not in one of the single-seater categories here right now. Fastest today, Nico Rosberg, again looking superb. I don't know how many people here were watching out on the circuit, but through Beckett's, this guy was just phenomenal. I thought his judgment and his precision, his accuracy, just amazing. Rob, Nico driving so well now.
Yeah, well, it suits him. It's a highly technical exercise. Not a great fan of the simulators as such, I don't think, but he used the simulators very well to go through the processes a lot. So when you're coming out onto the pit straight and you've got 9 buttons to push and you've got the DRS zone and a KERS and do these things, he patterned it in extremely well. Like that. He's a very, very bright guy. I mean, the time we've done work together, he's quite a technician. And an extremely good driver, and he can move about 10 things at once in his mind. Now that should be common sense. You'd hope people would be bright enough to do that, but he's looked at Lewis, I think, and thought, well, this guy's fast, but he's out-thinking him and making all those technical little details work for him. You were talking earlier about his tyre pressure things.
Yeah. Some of you may have heard it, but on the radio transmission before, I think, qualifying in Barcelona, we heard Nico's race engineer giving him the exact tyre pressures on all 4 corners on the lap before his pole lap, i.e. bring this left front or right front or left rear slightly up, Nico. That's how precise this guy's driving, and that's beautiful control. I mean, I presume you were doing that with Ralf Schumacher all the time back in the Toyota days.
I won't comment on that, but I think if you look at the tyre temperatures, I mean, his brother Michael was watching tyre temperatures when he was at his peak. Yeah. And it's quite interesting that when a driver gets to that situation, I think, where they're watching tyre temperatures or tyre pressures, and as you say, they're able to just process this huge amount of information. We talked about it yesterday. Nico he trains on a unicycle and juggles.
Yes.
So you start being able to just process massive amounts of information, and he comes into his own in a situation like this.
Lewis Hamilton, interesting. Where's he at right now, Rob?
Well, now, Jock Clear is of course, he's serious engineer over at Mercedes with Nico, I think, mostly. He's coming here later tonight, by the way, and he's going to sing some songs. So I don't know what he sounds like, but he's very confident. He's told us, we being the band as well, that he wants to sing Mac the Knife and a couple of Elvis Presley songs.
Now, I wonder if that's significant, this Mac
the
the Knife thing.
Could well be, yeah. And so Jock's turning up about 10:30 as soon as he's finished with all the Nico stuff over there. So we talked to Jock a little bit. Lewis, trying to do the fast driver thing. He's a naturally very, very fast driver, a bit like putting Jackie X or something in at his peak in a car, who could just drive really fast. And we know that Lewis has been surprised by the amount of work that Nico's putting in. And Lewis is still relying on just being a fast driver, which should be the way it is in motor racing, if he could be a true enthusiast. But he's just going to have to try harder and harder, and I don't think that necessarily works. I think once you're up with someone with Nico who's thinking of 10 things at once, so they should. I don't see that you have to be dense to be a racing driver, so they should be able to do that stuff, and it's often disappointing when they can't. But Lewis, and also they found Lewis's inputs slightly bigger and slightly rougher than what you'd expect. And
what do you mean by inputs? Just you don't mean verbal inputs in a meeting. You mean physical inputs in the car.
I mean verbal inputs in a meeting. Yeah. No. The way you pull the levers, it has a huge effect. The way you move your hands, the way you move your feet. You drive a car as much with your feet as you do with your hands. It's always good to have a little bit of shock absorbing, the shoulders and the ankles and that's not an ankle, a wrist, the ankles. Just a tiny amount of compression to say this is what's coming. And Jock was saying that Nico is spending a lot of time these days doing the stuff that we've been doing for forever, introducing the car to the brakes. It's not a hammer blow, boom. It looks like that on digital telemetry a lot because that's digital, but it doesn't pick up the 0.221 to the 0.227. You try turning your digital television set up from 0 to 1 and woof, it's quite loud, or 1 to 0. You don't want 0, you want 0.5, doesn't do it. That's a version of what you see on the telemetry, so you can get a funny idea about what's going on just by reading the telemetry. There's a feel that exists, and you know when you feel it. And I spend my time sitting beside these guys, lapping day in, day out, so you're feeling it in there, and this time difference does come. Lewis apparently a little bit more abrupt than I'm surprised about that, because he's a talented artist as a driver, and I thought he'd be a bit soft on that. That's what he's finding. Maybe we'll get Jock to talk about it at the gig.
Scarbs, while we're on the subject of Lewis and Nico, anything on Mercedes that caught your eye today?
Mercedes had quite a large package on the car, although to be honest you couldn't see much of it because most of it was based around a new floor and a slightly revised front wing when the flap, which is the last element in the stack of elements on your front wing, now spans the entire width of the wing. But apparently the drivers didn't like the feel of this around Silverstone, probably because there's quite a lot of bumps and breaks in the surface. So as I understand, they're going to revert back to the more standard configuration just to give the drivers that little bit more confidence. Just
on the subject of bumps, interesting to see Sergio Perez today saying afterwards in his press statement, we were working on ride control today. Unusual to hear a team say that these days, ride height and aero, but they're actually working on ride.
I mean, I think McLaren, that's probably one of the biggest problems that they have that's resulting from the aerodynamic problems that they've got, that they are setting the car up quite stiff, trying to maintain the ride height over a much smaller range. So as much as when you see the car you think, God, the suspension's set too stiff, that's their problem. It's not. It's because if they let the car move around more, then the aerodynamics would vary more and you get much more variation in downforce as the car's pitching and rolling. So yeah, there still has to be a compromise somewhere. They've got to get that primary ride back into the car somehow without upsetting the aerodynamics. So yeah, especially around Silverstone, which, as you say, is a fairly bumpy track. That's one of the key things they need to be looking at.
Red Bull looked very, very good today. Sebastian Vettel did a very, very good long run. So in terms of everybody else in the pit lane right now, the analysis they're doing, they're all saying, wow, Vettel again looks to be in very good shape. Mark Webber too quick. He was doing a lot of the tyre development work today. Anything on the Red Bull, Scarb, we should be talking about?
Red Bull, again, very small details, and it took quite a while to pick up some of the things. When they go out in sort of first practice, second practice, the first thing you notice is if they've got lots of sensors on the cars where they're running this Flow-Vis paint that's streaming bright green paint along the bodywork of the car. It's normally the sign that they're doing something new. And they've just changed some details around the exhaust pipes and at the back of the diffuser. And it appears to have stayed on the car. But I think this weekend, the cold weather is certainly, along with Mercedes, really probably helping them in their race simulations.
Well, one team looking for warmer weather, and I think we're going to get it. Hopefully we're going to get it. Fingers crossed. Saturday, Sunday is Lotus F1. Kimi saying that today. Had a bit of a chat to him after FP2 today, and he was saying, really they've got to hope that the weather does get a bit warmer from a tyre performance point of view where they are. And Kimi wearing his cap with the big peak, but it was looking a bit looser than normal because he's had a serious haircut, which has got something odd going on in the middle, I gather. And we were trying to persuade him to take his cap off, and he said, no, I wait for podium on Sunday for this one. So, we'll see what happens there. But he ran the device on the car, which I hear under the table in straight line tests last week, I think it was, when it was running on full throttle, 8 kilometers an hour quicker, which is a serious improvement. But it only works on full throttle, apparently. If you run it on half throttle, it's nothing like as efficient. So it sounds fairly, that's an interesting thing. Describe what this device is all about, Scarbs.
This is the device, which is what Lotus call it, and a lot of people have been calling it double DRS or passive DRS. You may remember they tested this system last year where you saw a system of ducts running up under the rear wing. And this effectively is a completely passive F duct. If you can all remember back to sort of 2010, the drivers, when they wanted to get a boost of straight line speed by stalling the rear wing and losing all the drag that the rear wing applies to the car, would put their hand over a little duct in the cockpit, or McLaren push their knees up against one. They've obviously been banned since 2010, but the ability for teams to want to stall the rear wing to lose the drag to get more top speed on the straights obviously remains, and they can't have DRS all of the time. So as we saw last year, Red Bull introduced this DRS activated drag reduction system. Again, that's been banned. But this system, basically what happens is as the car gains speed, the ducts around the driver's rollover hoop feed air, and at low speeds that just empties quietly underneath the monkey seat of the rear wing. But as you go faster, the flow inside here switches, and then the flow comes up underneath the rear wing and stalls the rear wing, which means you lose downforce, but critically you lose the drag. And as you say, that gives them 8 kilometers an hour more speed. And because that's legal, and because every time you reach a certain speed and this clicks in, that means you can get this speed boost at every straight on every lap of the race, which conventional DRS doesn't give you. So potentially this is a massive advantage. But we've seen them testing it now for a year, because they introduced it at Silverstone last year, but it still hasn't been race ready. And with the conditions this morning, I don't imagine they're going to be ready to race it this weekend, but I expect we will see it in Germany.
Well, if the conditions have been dry, I think the plan was going to be for Grosjean to run it tomorrow to see if they could verify the information they got from today and then to make a decision on the race. Probably, as you say, they won't do that now. But Grosjean's car also had, if I should just say here now, anybody has a question they'd like to throw at us about the topics we're discussing, I think, rather than anything too left wing or right wing.
Peter, just before we do that, can I just butt
sure,
in on
Andy.
that conversation,
please.
because I'd interviewed the two Lotus drivers only about an hour and a half ago. I got the impression Grosjean is going to run
is he?
it,
Okay.
And I got the impression Kimi's going to take it off. So that was a feeling.
Yeah, they were always going to run it on one car and then the other. So it's good that they're going to go ahead with that, and they got enough information. Earlier they were saying probably not, but thanks Andy for the update on that. So Grosjean probably will run that tomorrow. That's an interesting development. And he also had new bodywork on the car today, right?
Yeah, the two cars were very different. Kimi had the device on the back wing and had different front brake ducts, some rather groovy, modern-looking ones. But the Grosjean car probably had the most interesting change in that the side pods and the top bodywork on the back of the car have been shrunk right down around the engine and the gearbox. And it's that shrunk. It's very much like the Williams, where it appears as though the bodywork is literally just shrunk wrap around the back of the gearbox. And we were speaking about the Mercedes last night, who've done a very similar thing with their car. You know, this is a trade-off. They're having a lot less cooling effect in the car. And as we all probably realise, I don't think you can need a lot of cooling this weekend. But the benefit is you get a much better airflow through to the back of the car, and particularly to the rear wing, which again is obviously a performance advantage for the car.
Well, Williams still running that beautiful gearbox, probably still the smallest gearbox casing in the paddock.
It's still the most extreme. Other teams have started to get there, but I think Williams have taken it the furthest.
But lovely to see Williams this weekend celebrating their 600th Grand Prix, and some nice stuff they've done in the paddock, in the garage area. They've got a line of pictures of their world champion drivers in the little alleyway you drive down as you're going down to where the cars are actually being worked on. They've got a nice Williams 600 logo on the floor there of the garage, and particularly nice to see the little butterfly in the VW or the W on the nose of all the cars now, in memory of Lady Virginia Williams, who very sadly passed away earlier this year. And for those of you who may be wondering why it's a butterfly, it's because Ginny had on her wrist, about here, a little butterfly tattooed. And it was turquoisey light blue in colour. And it's because she just loved wildlife, and she loved her garden, and she was a wonderful gardener. But she loved that idea. And I was actually with her when she got that done, somewhere in darkest London. And she was told beforehand, this is going to be one of the most painful places in which to have it. And she said, good, that means no one else will have one there, so that's where I'm going to go for it. So Ginny, we remember you fondly, and I think it's a wonderful little gesture. They've got that on one side of the nose, and on the other side of the nose, same size logo, they've got the Ayrton Senna logo as well on Williams. So a big weekend for Williams. Let's hope they have a good one. Looking at the times today, they didn't look to be particularly good in these conditions. We saw Valtteri Bottas slightly quicker than Pastor Maldonado. Bottas also had a bit of an issue with the steering wheel. Actually, we had the steering wheels on the show yesterday, and one of the Williams wheels had a bit of a glitch. And whilst I was there after practice, Dickie Stanford was on the phone arranging to get it back to the factory to get it worked on. As you say, work of art, those steering wheels. Anything on the Williams we should be talking about technically?
I don't think there was anything so much new on the Williams that I picked up, but again, they're still playing with different nose configurations, different wing configurations, and they just seem to be forever alternating between different versions, and they don't seem to have bottomed out, what setup they want to run in that car, which is quite unusual.
Well, I have here a cap that I wore yesterday. So, Andy, you were about to say something?
I want to ask you, is
Yes.
it really the 600th Grand Prix of Williams? There's a lot of discussion about this, and I thought it was actually
No,
Germany.
we better repeat it.
Which races do you count?
Yeah.
Because the ones that were knocked out of the World Championship for all the stuff that went on years ago.
Yeah, we did talk about this yesterday, and the sad reality, well, it's not sad, the reality is that it's the 599th Formula One World Championship race as we know them. Let's put lots of italics in here, because I think the Williams list, for some reason, includes the 82 San Marino Grand Prix, which actually was a Grande Grand Prix without the Cosworth runners. You were there, I was there. But it doesn't include the 81 South African Grand Prix, which was a non-championship race if we look at the stats now. But I was at that race as well. I don't know if you were there. And I was on the grid standing next to Carlos Reutemann's Williams, and it was wet. It was looking doubtful if it would clear, and Carlos was making a decision what tyres to start on. He went on slicks, and about 5 minutes before the start of the race, one of the senior members of the Formula One power braking fraternity wandered near Carlos's car, and Carlos said, "Shake my hand and tell me that this race will count for World Championship points." And it was a valid question because none of the FIA Grande teams were competing. It was just a Cosworth race. And this gentleman shook Carlos's hand, looked him in the eye and said, "Yes, this race will count for points. Go out there." And Carlos won the race. got his 9 points, obviously. And 3 months later, as part of the settlement in Formula One and to bring peace in our time, the points were taken away from that South African Grand Prix win, and Carlos then lost the World Championship by 1 point.
Yeah.
And that really was one of the reasons he was so annoyed after Las Vegas in '81. So I include that, really. I think Williams are entitled to include that because it was a race well won. Carlos drove beautifully on slicks in the early wet phase and then took advantage of the drying track to win the race. Good win. So there we are. Andy, yeah, absolutely.
The hat.
Oh, the hat. Yeah, we're just getting on to James Hunt. But actually, you've just reminded me of something else. I've looked down at the GP2 results of qualifying, and we have a certain Marcus Ericsson on the pole. And I glibly say, oh, he's one of your drivers, Rob. But can you, when I say that, Rob, can you actually explain what I mean by that? Because you and I both know what we mean. But you've done a lot of work with Marcus Ericsson. Here he is on the pole for GP2.
Oh, yes, we've done many days with Marcus, lots and lots, and good guy, fast, good sense of humour. And it was actually Kenny Brack who won the Indy 500.
Yeah.
And the Indy Championship, who got behind Marcus. I worked with Kenny in the early 90s, and we took him to America. And then once he'd quit, he decided he'd try and help some Swedish drivers. So Marcus, how old would Marcus be now? I don't know.
They're all about 23, aren't they?
Yeah, I know. Yeah, they're just out of that sort of decimal point age. And so, but when they're all about, he got about 6 drivers over from Sweden. And I guess they're about 14 or 15 or 16 or something. Marcus was one of those. And we went through them day after day up at Bruntingthorpe. And Marcus, who's quite a tall chap now, we had to sort of sit him up to be able to see through the windscreen. And so we pounded around and decided of all of them, Marcus would be the one. And he's subsequently gone on and just done very well.
And what makes your system unique, Rob, I think, is that you sit next to these drivers all the time in standard road cars on a circuit that is identical from day to day. So it's the same track that you would have been working on with Kimi Raikkonen and Nelson Piquet Jr. and all sorts of other drivers, David Coulthard, and you bring them to this same lap in a road car, and you can back-to-back them. You have a database there, but beyond that, you're sitting next to them while they're heel and towing, gear shifting, braking, and you have a stopwatch.
Yes, and I'll go out and do a lap as well, and we'll set a baseline lap time within, it'll be within a tenth or two of what it should be, and then we know what one of those is, and then for the next, 80 laps each day, I'm in the passenger seat, watching them, timing them, and then thinking, well, what about this? What about that? There comes a 10th, and you put a structure into them. So you must brake like this, decrease the brakes, get a direction change, do all that stuff, and they then hopefully go faster. When that's done, then we tend to put this varnish on it, which is when I say, when it feels right, copy that. When I say this feels right, and there's a certain feel that you must try and get into a driver, and when it suddenly feels right, they're thinking about it, they go a bit slower for a while, and then the braking's good, the brake of decrease is good, the steering is better, the throttle, anything, that's good. And suddenly there's 0.4 of a second. From your average, something of a misnomer Grand Prix driver, you can sit there with 8 of the one on the grid here at the moment.
Pete, can I just dive in? Because I was at one of Rob's sessions last year with a young American driver, I remember, who just won a race the other day, Gustavo Menendez. And these kids...
Did he? Good on him.
Yeah, he won one of the ATS Formula 3 Cup races at the Lausitz Ring. So they come along and they see this bloke, Rob Wilson, and this old guy, and he keeps stopping down.
I'm in the band tonight.
He's stopping, and he goes out, he does a lap with them, and he stops and has a cigarette, and then he gets back in, and they think, I'm just going to blow him. He did this time. He must be really, slow, and then he just can't get anywhere close to it. And they scratch their head.
And Richard, you've got first-hand experience with this, haven't you? Not yourself, but as a father.
I know, and my son was about to start GP3, and he'd been racing in Porsche and Maserati before that, and it was recommended to send him over to Rob, So he went over, arrived in the morning, and he called me, and he said, "There's nothing here." He said, "There's a rental car. There's Rob."
We have to explain that Rob uses rental cars.
No, they're not rental cars.
Hearst doesn't know.
Manufacturer supplied.
So basically, he's standing there, and he rang me, and he said, "Look," but I tell you, he spent 3 days, I think, in total, and I've never seen anybody influence him like you have, and the change in the way he thinks about his driving, and he became a very smooth, much quicker driver because of it, and it was amazing to see that transition.
Well, good of you to say thank you for that, Richard. Big thing that you do with them is you develop a two-tier system of driving so that you separate the fear from the feel. So that what you see coming out the windscreen, you're staring death in the face, or your career end because your teammate is faster than you, or something like that, the stress level. And that's clearly going to ruin things for you, but you've got to pull the levers down here in the same way. And so when you look like you're going to die, like if a kid runs out in front of you on the road, poof, you've got to jump on the brakes, please stop, stop, stop. The car would stop sooner if you can train your brain to just move in a certain way. There's a ramping up that's not shown, as we said before, on the digital stuff quite so easily, or if you can see it, you can't necessarily relate what that means. And that's the part of it, just separating the fear from the feel, so that you can keep moving at the same rate at a threshold, though easy to do slow, no matter what you're faced with.
Ian, I think do we have a question down there, Ian, with the roving mic? Is that correct?
I'm going to ask. So,
Okay.
This is on behalf of the gentleman here, and the question is, and it's probably to Rob. Make sure if I get this wrong, you can poke me. Rob, as a driver coach, drivers turn up. We noted Kimi, Nico, Lewis, massively talented, naturally. What do you add as a driver coach to those guys?
Everyone is an individual. So you won't just put a one size fits all. There's clearly a result you want at the end, which is the fastest lap time. But I will sit with them for a while. Maybe you've done 7 or 8 laps, 10 laps beside them with the stopwatch going, and you just start to pick up little things that they do that may be holding them up. Not everyone is the same. You'll be sitting with one driver, and then you'll notice an excess of wheel movement going into a corner, just like this. They're boxing at shadows. Sometimes they'll say, well, I'm trying to feel the grip of the car in doing that, but 8 laps in, you're not still trying to do that. It's usually just a little anxiety moment. You might find that. Others will come off the brake too suddenly. I think I just got to get going. Others on the throttle too soon. Individual things that they have. They say, well, look, let's fix that. And there's always something. And I know it's surprising when you look at them from the outside roaring around, you think not. But when you're sitting in there and timing them in the same car, and you pick up little differences.
And I think the other point that has to be made is that a lot of people believe and imagine that there's nothing in a road car that can be learnt that is applicable to a Formula One car. But of course, the fact that so many Formula One engineers now share the days with their drivers, with Rob, and sit in the back seat of the car show that is completely untrue. There's a direct correlation.
That's been a big help doing that with the engineers. I've had Sam Michael on the phone today. There's a couple of their drivers come up and coming up. Paddy Lowe has been sitting in the car. He's just gone off to become Mercedes person, but he had a few months off.
Adrian Newey?
Obviously Adrian, yeah. I say for someone as sensitive and clever as you have an amazing arrogance of assumption, that I say, you do this, He said, but if the car will take it, and I go, but what car? So Adrian's a bit I've teammated with Adrian, that lovely, terrific guy, but I just wish you'd just ease off a little bit. But yes, having the engineers is a very, very good thing, and call it a road car, which they are, it amplifies the inputs. If you're in a go-kart or something that's really stiff, then a lot of that is just camouflage because it's over. And we're almost talking to some people now about slowing the simulators down so that when you do something, you can see the shock waves as a result of it, or resonance, as Paddy Lowe calls it, or energy spikes, as Valtteri Bottas has called it. You go boom like that, and there are shock waves. That could be in through the braking, that could be through the throttle, it could be through the steering, and all of those little ripples effects slow the car down. So you need to be able to do it at a rate that's harmonized. And getting someone to do that on the absolute threshold, lap after lap, corner after corner, is difficult. Then, can I just finish on one point here? And there's no point then practicing the one corner over and over again, because you're always carrying baggage when you arrive at that corner a lap later. You've come around the previous corner, 50 revs up on your lap. You think, if I can just sustain this for another 2 meters, I'll be on pole position. Or you've made a mess of the previous corner, you come around and your survival instinct kicks in. You brake a little bit early. You realise you're going slower, you come off the brakes a bit sooner, you get understeer. So you've got to get rid of the baggage that they carry and make sure all those previous corners are done right.
And to put it truly into perspective, let me just tell you two other things about Rob. One, as far as I know, the only driver that's ever beaten him on a lap of Bruntingthorpe between the cones in a road car is Kimi Raikkonen.
I don't think that's right. No, I don't think he's right.
You don't think Kimi did beat you?
I don't think no. Well, he says there's a big argument over it because he said I hit the cone and that was on one of these corners. They're not all coned, and that's why I went faster. But that was a previous lap, that was one of the slower ones, But it's stuck in his mind; it'll never move.
And the other thing about Rob is he plays a mean bass guitar, and you're going to hear that in a bit. So he's a pretty talented guy. Let's move on now to this cap, because I'm very keen to finish the show with some memories and some chat about the 1976 world champion James Hunt, who, well, he was as much at home here at Silverstone as he was at Brands Hatch. We all know that. We all know how much the crowd loved him. And you're going to get a new feel for James when I think most of you will go out and watch the new movie coming out called Rush, which is coming out in September, I believe. There's going to be a lot of chat about James Hunt and Niki Lauda, of course, and what happened in that 76 season. And in addition, I can tell you, there's a BBC documentary coming out at about the same time about the 76 season with interviews with some of the key players from both the Ferrari and the McLaren teams from that season. So it's going to be a big thing. But today is a great day just to chat a little bit about James Hunt, because today is the day the Hunt family have released the first line of merchandise around James Hunt's name, and that's available, I understand, on the Vodafone McLaren Mercedes website. McLaren obviously being the team in which James won his championship, and it's a kind of what they call a soft launch. They're just getting it all going. But if you want to if you're t-shirts, caps, beautiful stuff, and this is a lot of time in the making. This is the colours of Wellington College you see here. So that meant going to Wellington College, getting the approval to do that, and obviously getting the whole thing designed and made. I think the designer of everything is a very, very talented graphic designer based in Los Angeles, and there's going to be a lot of follow-up to this. So I'm wearing this over the weekend, and there are lots of other things out there, but I thought it was an appropriate moment just to end the show if we could, all of us, just talk a little bit about James. And I know you knew James Hunt long before he was in Formula One. I mean, when were you first aware of his name, Andrew?
Oh, in Formula Ford. I didn't recognise his name when he was mini racing. As soon as he got into Formula Ford, I knew the people who were running him, and they told me, this guy's pretty quick, and he's quite a character too. And then followed him through Formula 3 and into Formula 1, and was part of his management team for a while.
Well, yeah, I didn't know that.
Yes, indeed,
yeah.
We did.
It was CSS.
CSS.
Time, yeah.
I mean, we did amazing things, like we put a deal together where he was promoting Vauxhall, and probably Vauxhall Vivas or something, and he was racing a Ford Cosworth engine car, which we were pretty pleased with that deal, I tell you, and he earned quite a bit of money. I think I told you, Peter, when I was at Motoring News, for 1 year, he did a column for us, which came in the form of pages written in an exercise book, which had been torn out, which of course meant that it all had to be typed out. So and they were beautifully written, because obviously Wellington is a very good school, and he learned to write very nice English. So I happily typed out his column, and then I took the pages from the exercise book and I just tossed them into the waste paper bin. I wish I hadn't done that, 'cause probably would have been worth a bit of money now.
But he was a very funny guy, wasn't he? I mean, he was never short of exactly the right thing to say at exactly the right moment.
No, he had the quick quip, certainly. And I used to have parties at my house in a Formula 3 meeting. We had half the grid back. I'm not sure the young journalists now have the same relationship with those up-and-coming drivers that we had. It obviously is a more complicated situation. And
didn't you have Jody Scheckter sleeping on your floor or something?
Yes, he did, and he complained about the food we fed him in his book. And he said what he actually said is, I stayed at Marriott's flat. We ate like dogs. Now, what we actually did, and we said that because what we actually fed him was that Frey Bentos meat out of a tin, and there was nothing wrong with it. And the potatoes were cooked fine, but he said we ate like dogs. He thought he was eating dog meat. James wouldn't say that. James came to that same flat, 73 Baker Street, judging competitions with me. I mean, people think that he was a bit of a dilettante, but actually he took a lot of the stuff very seriously indeed.
What do you mean competitions? Motoring competitions?
Oh yeah, and
Quizzes.
yeah. I think there's I've forgotten what it was, but there was several different ones we did. Molly Slip Man of the Year. I don't know what the hell it was, but he was always very civil, and he always took those things very seriously. And
he was. I mean, I know in the film he comes over as a sort of spoiled, upper class
I don't think
English
he was.
twit. But he wasn't that
No,
at all. He
he
was
wasn't
actually
that.
very hard working as well.
Yeah.
I mean, he dug roads for a while and did a few other odd things when he was just trying to finance that Formula Ford season.
Yeah. So, I've done a little bit of commentary on the film, a race at Crystal Palace, him against Niki Lauda. It never happened, because that's the basis of the film. It's based on, it's not absolutely true to fact. And but because a lot of people knew him from Formula 3 as Hunt the Shunt, and that was my old mate Mike Doodson, I just saw in the paddock. But it wasn't Hunt the Shunt, it was Hunt the Shunt and Crashley Ashley. And
Ian Ashley.
Ian Ashley is still racing to this very day.
But racing well too, driving well.
But no, James, a great character, and because women loved him, as we know. And I don't think there's anybody like that anymore.
And just to give you an idea of Andrew's position back then, writing for Motoring News and Autosport were the two deadly competition, actually,
Deadly
weren't
rivals,
they? Deadly rivals. And Motoring News was the newspaper version, if you like. An incredible detail and incredible attention to detail from journalists like Andrew. But they never published the names of the writers in full. It was always initials, and you were ARM. What was your middle name?
Robert.
Robert.
And why didn't they? Because the proprietor, the venerable Mr. Wesley T, decided if they knew our names, maybe one of the rival magazines would come and poach us. That was rather his fuzzy logic. Now, everybody knew who we were anyway, and we got paid 3 and 6pence as well, but we always got good cars. I mean, I arrived fresh-faced, 21 years old from Derby, and sat in a Lotus Cortina.
Brilliant. And he had a column called Armchair Comment, as you can imagine, ARM. And that's how James used to refer to you, correct?
He always called me Arm. Did he know my name? I'm not sure. I was just Arm.
Morning, Arm. Hello, Arm.
Yeah.
Richard, James Hunt, what does that mean to you?
I think just one of the great characters, somebody that you looked up to as you were growing up and coming into motorsport, and probably in my case rallying was my first love, and probably still is to a large extent, but certainly in terms of Formula One, the character of James Hunt just lives with you, because it was, as we said, unfortunately nowadays there's very few characters in the sport of that kind of ilk, which is, the sport has changed enormously. I think probably Kimi comes as close to it as most of us would know at this stage. But still, there's no, I didn't know him obviously, but you read about him, admired him, and followed him, and just one of the great characters, which I think did so much for the sport itself that we probably don't really recognise that as to what it was like Motoring News. It was an institution. And he was in Formula One for a relatively short time, but I think it did a lot of good for the sport.
But of course he was in things like Texco ads on ITV when a much bigger audience now with Morecambe and Wise. I probably remember that ad, and he was very much in the public perception as a big star.
And of course his Formula One career was short because he raced in an incredibly dangerous period. Not only in Formula One, but in all forms of racing. I mean, we were talking earlier about that horrendous Formula 3 accident at the French Grand Prix circuit Rouen, where a very talented young French driver, Jean-Luc Salomon, sadly lost his life. And James was kind of involved in the accident and saw the whole thing firsthand. And that was at a very influential time of his career. And he just had, like all the drivers at that time, had to live with that level of danger. And James, I think his view was, there's a job out there that needs to be done. I'm a professional Formula One driver. The minute I get in that car, I give it 100%. But I'm going to be very careful about the teams for which I drive, and I'm going to limit the amount of time that I'm in, that I expose myself to this danger. If I can win a world championship, I'll get out. And it was a good attitude. It was the correct attitude. Jody Scheckter kind of had the same attitude as well. And James, for me, was two different people. He was James, the racing driver, but James, the driver out of the car, completely on another planet in some ways. Yeah. I've told this story a couple of times, but I love repeating it. And that was the 76 Canadian Grand Prix before the start of a very critical race in James's championship year. That against Nicky, he'd just lost his points from Brands Hatch, an event I'm sure you remember very well. And we were chatting before the race, sitting on some grass by the side of the grid about I don't know what really. And suddenly James looked at his watch and said, "Gosh, it's at the time. I must get my man to start my engine," and ran back onto the grid. He was a Spitfire pilot, basically. Exactly the same attitude.
Yeah. If I just dive in, you mentioned Rush, and so I did voiceover on the '76 Japanese Grand Prix, which I'd done originally. They wanted me to copy what I'd done before, which is very hard. But shut my eyes on this Australian accent, the actor. That's James Hunt. That's how he sounded. The guys somehow got him to a T.
Great. Well, that's Rush. I'm sure you all know that movie's coming out. Rob, your thoughts on James as a racing driver? How fast was James Hunt?
I think for about 18 months he was the fastest driver in the world. I think the M23 McLaren, Gordon Coppock's car, and that lasted for nearly 2 years when the car worked. When he liked the wide tyres, I think. He liked it when the car absolutely worked. And then I don't think anyone could drive one any faster. And you would, I'm thinking, just while you're talking, I think you'd remember Chris Marshall, I think, who was semi-managing him.
Yeah.
Because his garage was right next door to where I lived in Barnes. I'd look out the window, and that was where James was being managed from, and the car sales was there. And I went and bought an Alfa Giulia Super from there in 1973. And then went up to the British Grand Prix with them in '73, when with that team, and then of course James came fourth there behind Denny Holman. So watched them from an earlier age, but only when he got into form. Nothing like you, but that was it. I used to look out the window and look at the people managing when Chris wasn't hiding under the desk because somebody came to ask for money.
Yeah, I think we probably nicked him off Chris, actually.
That's what happened. It was probably you he was hiding from. Because he would come in and his secretary would say, "Well, I'm standing," and say, "No, he's not here," and he was actually under the desk.
I've got to ask you, Andy, about that Night of the Stars, the British Grand Prix in '76, the Albert Hall, James Hunt, the trumpet.
Voluntary.
Purcell's trumpet voluntary.
Indeed, yes. Played it beautifully.
That's
it.
Yeah. Lovely. And he played it very well.
Played the trumpet at school. And he just wanted to, he volunteered. He could do this, and he wanted to do it at that Grand Prix Night of the Stars, which was a fantastic event, actually. And he did it wonderfully. And I've got a beautiful cartoon with him, sort of centre of the cartoon with him with the trumpet.
Scarbs, last word with you on James. I'm sure it's a little bit before your time, but nonetheless...
I'm glad you said that rather than me having to point it out, Peter.
All these old fogies. Well, not Richard. Richard's still a young lad, obviously.
But my knowledge of James Hunt, I mean, probably thinking now, literally just sat here now, probably makes me realise how influential he was, because my knowledge of James Hunt predates me and myself watching the Grand Prix. I mean, I was 8 years old during the '76 season. But one of my key memories is James Hunt and Barry Sheen being on the Brute Splash-On adverts. And we had two world champions, and as an impressionable boy, it's like, wow, the British are fantastic, aren't we? We've won the bikes and the cars, and probably after that, I probably did start to develop a direct interest in motorsport, and probably simply because James Hunt was that personality that transcended the sport and came, as you said, advertising Vauxhall Vivas, and my other memory is him being in Superstars, if everybody remember watched that series, and I probably was the only guy in the program that smoked and couldn't lift his arms up high enough to do the bench press. So he probably was more influential than maybe I'd thought about before this evening.
Well, James Hunt, and as I say, this new line of merchandise released today. So if you're a James Hunt fan, you want to get into the whole Rush James Hunt thing, there you go. Right, it's time to call an end to, unless Ian, have you got anything we need to add there? Okay, anybody got any comments? No. We need to call an end to this second of our two live shows from Silverstone. It's been a real thrill to be able to be here and to be a part of this whole British Grand Prix weekend, chatting to Derek Warwick today, who's president of the BRDC, saying that ticket sales have improved massively in the last couple of days. I believe there are still small opportunities to buy tickets for race day, but already this British Grand Prix lining up to be amongst the top 3 of the best sellers they've had. So that's great news for everybody involved. I'd like to personally thank everybody involved in putting together these 2 shows, 3 if we include the Avanade show we did from Lotus F1 on Wednesday. I'd like to thank Robert and Rish and Umbreen and Dylan from the knockout side of things, that's the production side, and particularly Ian, Emma and Sonny from the Haymarket side. It's been wonderful. I'd like to thank too Andrew Marriott, Richard Cregan, Rob Wilson and Craig Scarborough. Great insight into so many aspects. We could go on for hours, but we've got something else we need to do now, and that is a band. Grand Prairie are going to play. And if you think this guy's a good driver coach, as I say, wait till you hear him sing and play the bass. We'll be back again next week as we look back at the British Grand Prix, at what happened. Not quite sure how we're going to do that yet. There are so many wonderful people out there with whom we can speak. We'll find some good people, don't worry. That'll be out again next Thursday on YouTube. Don't forget, you can watch us on YouTube or on iTunes. We have a really, really fast download capability on iTunes now, so take your pick. But initially, we're out on YouTube, so we look forward to that. In the meantime, have a great British Grand Prix weekend. Take care.